나은저 잠반야샤시 고라시야체 나 잠반야샤 다당한저 지당 잠반야샤세디 나 저기 다 지당 다 대사 지소나랑 저 잠반야샤 럽규스 장규스 잠반야샤세디다 삼당 곰다디다 디급소시에기 잠반야샤 곰나디 되스카가라 최고래 다디 디급소시에기 잠반야샤디 람레요 레세 람레 람냠네 지행 가사규르마도 샨다이규라 요마레.
Good morning. Today we're continuing to look at the 4 close placements of mindfulness. So in society there's a great interest in the topic of mindfulness, and some may also even be engaging in meditation or a close placement of mindfulness. However, what is generally spoken about or meant by mindfulness in society is quite different from what we're looking at here. What we're looking at here is the actual practice of what we're looking at here is only found in the continuum of someone who already has a mental path.
나는 균 다지가 저기 지소라 양아서 잠만야샤 공부여서 공나라비아디 장하데 가래람나 미바데다 저기 술미나다 다 베네술을 샤바 소수술 샤바이나 소수술이야 미시 셈제지도 미시 잠바된제 셈샤는 넘버 마양와시 류랑라 남도 차상 샴바 차상가 류랑라 제지도 내지 류용어를 파 다제 셈제지도 내 셈디 아니 세우제 아니 유itel레 제지 내디hen 고미아디 저기 아다 담만야샤 고미아사디 지소치아디 디시고로와.
In general, the way mindfulness or close placement of mindfulness is approached in society is that one would take an object to meditate on, for example, the body, and hold that with mindfulness, trying to avert the following any distractions that arise, and just remain with the object.
나는 아주 류래 미바 용거래 당아주 류기 초와를 미세 셈 초와날 봐 즉 초와 가는 용구도 초와랑 삼다지 류 초와들라 미제 초와랑 삼다 현다 남도 차상까지 초와들 미제 될야 초와 가는 용구도 선들이 봐 제지도 다시 셈 넘버 마양와제 되는 셈 세우지 되네게 네되 받으라 고미야들라 당아주 그 초와를 미제 안자만야자 공부하세 시고로와.
A second object that is quite common is that of the feelings. And the way that feelings is utilized as an object of mindfulness in society is the feelings are observed, and they're observed with mindfulness, and the practitioner tries to avert following any distractions that may arise, just observing the feelings. Maybe being aware of the arisal and the fall, but just observing and trying not to be distracted. So very similar to the object of the breath or the body. A third commonly used object is that of the breath. And here with mindfulness, mindfulness is placed on the breath, and again the practitioner tries not to follow any distractions that arise, but just observe the breath, the inhalation, the exhalation, and so forth, just observing the breath.
Kaya shen sam namdo kaya kima jiba je kaji lujibu samdaji lule zechidu nye je drambiki zinji lule drambe zin zechidu sem zechidu nye je deniga gom myodu kabla da du chene semlia nipa me de ke ni ku ni ra ma ku che pe na tom tom je kaya Jenny Mebache, and the Niam Okuache, Denike Goro Jikaze, Dena, Duscor, Dutuyagi, to the Chehata, to the Jikta, Denike Dutuya of Jungrua, the Chisadi, Dake of Sokarakumasan, Yudi Subu de la Michi, Sukti Yudi, me bigger Yudi, Sebu Tungo, Sebu Mataje, Natom Rochiorda, Niam Okuache. And Kugomra, then any Kuadurache, Natom Rakayama, really she Gyälwa, and the Muparo Chagor, Mupasig Mado, did Peshe Japanese Compasa, the Chagma,
With this approach to mindfulness, or a close placement of mindfulness, then there is a danger of the result not being nearly as effective as it could be. For example, if the observed object is that of the body, and is being held with mindfulness, and through repeated training, then the meditator is getting quite skilled, and they are not being drawn away by distraction, and they can hold the object of the body single-pointedly. However, the quality of this, the mind that is holding the object, that is far from ideal. It may be a mind without fatigue, and therefore the object can be held for 30 minutes or maybe even an hour, but the mind is dull and it's weak, which means that the object, the body, doesn't appear clearly. And the mind that is of mindfulness, that is apprehending it, is weak and dull. So therefore this would not be classified as a close placement of mindfulness.
Jebachi dukengi jambada sherap ni dela ane jambanya chasigore denigum kaso yu rangi miba lu sor sem chö shi ga gangru chi le mi je an jambada shi shi ni ge wone je ne ane lango lamju lam dela jambada shi ni ge du bi ge da lam yo ngo ju ba dela an jambanya chasigore lam용오 줄바 lam용오 lam게 인고고로 당오 줄바라는 람 인켄질라고 하다가제 캔바식으로와 베네 이제 캔바라는 람라고 하다가 좀 모샤도 유미바 류쇼 셈체 실라미네 안 담바다 아까소래 랑지 친인이 요거냐 따네 곰비게 담바다 시시 가루 뒤비게 미바데 류쇼 셈체 실라미네 ane karche oresene rangda ji tsini ni jine dane gombe ane jamba da sherap gangru yu dibige lamshu ki kemba sigore dene chilane jamba dikap sebe jamba nyasha sigore adi won mayor ngo adi le.
Whilst then someone practicing the way described is engaging in a practice that is called mindfulness, the result that they attain is not what is referred to here as a practice of a close placement of mindfulness. So rather what is being described here and how we are being guided to practice is to take the four observed objects sequentially, the observed objects of the body, feelings, the mind and phenomena, hold them with mindfulness and investigate them with wisdom. And for this to be an actual placement of mindfulness, the meditator needs to have a mental path in their continuum. Here I draw your attention to the entity or the definition of a close placement of mindfulness, which comes a little later in the text, comes on the sixth page, the fourth outline. An exalted wisdom engaged in practicing a path included in mindfulness and wisdom, having investigated the general and specific characteristics of any of the four, body, feelings, mind, and phenomena. So here you can see you have the observed objects of either body or feelings and so forth, and the meditator who has a path in their continuum, an exalted wisdom, is engaging in the object with mindfulness and wisdom, investigating first the specific characteristic and then the general characteristics of that observed object. So this is the style of meditation that is being presented here. And this is what is meant by an actual close placement of mindfulness.
Chö tamje dinane jinane dyru gore bene lü labdu ne sugi chö tamje lüna dyruwa ane chowa la do chowa chasan chowa nan dysare dene chowa che dene ga sem la du sem chasan dina dysa da chö labyo du da chowa da sem na su ma nge ke chö ngobo ina da tapa ina da chasan dina chö na le dyruwa chasan dambanya ja chasan dambanya mi ba sha ya de nga zo da kapte cha de mi ba de lü ane chowa sem chö shi di mi ba la sha jerwa.
In this practice then of close placement of mindfulness, there are 4 observed objects, hence the title, the 4 close placements. The 4 refer to the 4 observed objects of the body, of feelings, of the mind, and phenomena. And all phenomena, all existence, are included here, are included within these 4 observed objects. You remember when we looked at what is meant by the observed object of the body, with its 3 subdivisions, it includes all form. All form is included in there. Then the second observed object of feelings has the 3 types of feelings included. Mind has all primary consciousnesses, or main minds. Phenomena include then all other existence. So the mental factors other than feelings, or other impermanent phenomena not included thus far, and all permanent phenomena. So therefore, all existence, all phenomena are included within these 4 observed objects.
소알에 미네 담바니자 komya semla mine 담바니자 komya 안철라 mine 담바니지 미 komya 아사데 어두 시시 고라데 코파 예와라 쳔데 더 kom나 쳔데.
So therefore, when engaging in a close placement of mindfulness, one does so on one of the observed objects, the body, feelings, the mind, or phenomena.
ane ganes kumgore lamyodu ane lula mine ane tamanya ganes kumgore ladu lula mine ane rangi tsinyi jebaje ane di jela ane di ji tsinyi ane samata jebaje kumgores ane dinashin chowala dan dene chowala mine tamanya kumyodo chowadela rangi tsinyi dangbo rangi tsinyi jebaje kum di jela ane ji tsinyi jebaje kum Di nashin, ne semla ya dangbo rangi tsingi di jeba chekom, dene ji tsingi jeba chekom, dene chwe de la ya dangbo rangi tsingi di jeba chekom, an di ga jela, ane ji tsingi jeba chekom go re jirwa.
So those were the 4 observed objects which we looked at in the first outline. Now in the second outline, one comes to look at how to do this meditation. So one meditates sequentially through the 4 observed objects in the order presented, and within each one follows the same sequence. So one starts with the first object of the body, and one there meditates first on the specific characteristics of the body, and then the 4 general characteristics. Thereafter, one moves to the second observed object, that of feelings, and one meditates on the specific characteristic relating to feelings, and you'll see these at the top of page 4. And then thereafter one meditates on the 4 general characteristics of feelings. And these were called general because they are shared, or in general, they relate to all 4 of the observed objects, whereas the specific characteristics relate to each of the observed objects specifically or individually. Then thirdly, one moves to the third observed object, that of the mind, meditates on its specific characteristic, and thereafter on its 4 general characteristics. And then one concludes with the fourth observed object, phenomena, meditating on its specific characteristic, and then its 4 general characteristics.
Sa chu me lung jua xi xie andi gan la ji yong re sa ji ro ane ria cha ben su je su ji ro ria cha di xi xie jua xi xie di cho je cho ne zhu de bi ge su 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 rong wa ji la ane su ge rang ge chen xi go la su xie de rang ge chen ni la su ko rong ge ngo ro ji kan de xi la na rangi tsengi se sukorong ngoro sikora da sukorong ganeshi ngo ganeshi la de sa chu me lung che jungwa xi che di ga la ne su jungwa xi che di cho de ane ga du bo re se ne ane su du yong go re di yong go re ro yong go ria ja yong go re je sa su ji ro ria ja xi che sa chu me lung xi che di cho ne du de ge ge de ne su su ru wa se o de ne gan zo ge 가서 원비 셰베하고 토야게 된데 수수로 와질라 수용어 사 디시월다지 장이 친이래 디술마도 셴셰발요 말에 아니 가서래 데메디제다 셰바 마연케기 수 마연케기 쳐라 요말 따바라 요말 셰발라 요말 가서 요말 가서네 디 줍디긴 차상 게 뒤이제 줍디긴 수수로 와디 나 술마도 현달매래 제가 디인자 고수코로 제가 수 육모디 간에서 되는시 사지고 또 디랑이 챙이라고 할때 수랑이 챙이지 오래
Then one starts the meditation with the first of the 4 observed objects, the body, and then starts with meditating on its specific characteristic. What is meant by the specific characteristic of each observed object is the specific characteristic is its entity or its essence. What is the essence of that observed object of the body? And that we see here at the top of page 4. It refers, with respect to the body, the entity of elements and composites of the elements, which means that the body, you remember from the 3 classes of body, for the 3 divisions of the observed objects of the body, includes all form. So it includes form, sound, smell, taste, and touch. All those objects of form, sound, smell, taste, and touch. And what are those observed objects' entity? It's the 4 elements of earth, fire, water, and air, as well as their composites. So this specific characteristic, this entity, applies only to form, or only to the body. It doesn't apply to other phenomena, such as other impermanent phenomena, such as consciousness, or permanent phenomena. This entity, or the specific characteristic, applies only to form or to the body.
세가르스는 미다바디 지생이래 아니 미다바디 지생미 윤가르라네 미다바세도 줄라 요래 셰발라 요래 아니 데메디지 응오보 셰바가서 셰바다 데메디제다 아니 수도 차상을 요딩에 저 미다바디 진짜 미다바디 차상을 요바디 지생이래 지바래서 대지디 코로나 수코로나마다 잔달 멤버서 랑게 생이서 지나가는 뒤로와데 잘라치네 차상을 베지다야디 지비 베지 잘라라 그러와 소소랑 베지다야디 나 게르기 잘라라 그러와 디나지로와다 미다바세야디 수라 요레 셰발라 요레 데메디젤 요레 차상을 요데바인자 미다바세 지레 지칭이래 디나신 둥어와 세야디 지칭이래 둥알와 세조와 미다바 둥알와 동와 다음에 바시로와 미다바 둥아바 디비스나 두아데 미다 둥아 동아 다음에 봐세 아디 온 마데데 오 이데 양세데요 저라 니 저라 라고 여서들래 데데 데 양세 두면 Diwon ma diwo de deyang se do ode. Deyang se do a. 저 주위에서 민데 디워마 되다데. 디워데. 다들 미카미 예송 베시 어디. 아데 데도 안 미카 라고 뜨는데 deyang se do. 어디. 제가 미다바 둥와와 똥와 다음에 지칭이라도 제가 미다바 세야디 지칭이래. 둥와와 대 지칭이래. 똥와 세야 지칭이래. 다음에 봐 지칭이래 제래. 지상 먼저 미다바 세야디 지칭 좀 제시 미다바데 가르스는 가와를 요래서네 수래 요래 셰바라 요래 데메디지 차상을 요반서 그 차상을 캡되어 지칭이래 제. 디나시 둥아와 세 지칭이래 가서는 수래 둥아 근데 둥아 덴바들 수 망고요. 둥아 덴바레 셰바 둥아 덴바요 수 둥아 덴바요 데메디요. 제가 둥아 덴바 세야디 수다 안 데메디제다 셰바 차상을 캡되어 봐서 아니 지칭이래 제. 디나신 동화 세야디가 아니 지칭이래 차상을 캡되어 봐도 동화. 안 다음에 봐디야 아니 차상을 캡되어 봐서 지칭이래. 제가 디 시보들이 지칭이래라고.
Then having meditated on the specific characteristic of the body, meditated on its entity, then one meditates on its four general characteristics. And the general characteristics, the first we see is impermanence. So why is impermanence a general characteristic? And it is because it doesn't apply solely to the observed object of the body. It applies to all observed objects. Another way to express it, remembering that the four observed objects includes all phenomena, everything that exists. Therefore, the general characteristics can be applied to all phenomena, everything that exists. So impermanence, then this general characteristic applies to all impermanent phenomena, not just the body. So it applies to consciousness and non-associated compounded phenomena. With the meaning of non-associated compounded phenomena means impermanent phenomena other than consciousness and matter. So hence, the general characteristics are called general characteristics. Likewise, with suffering, it's applied to the other impermanent phenomena too, as well as, suffering really should be in the nature of suffering, and emptiness as well as selflessness. These apply to all of the observed objects.
That is a Dang Nima that Lula Mine Jamanish Comnati Chevre in a Yanjachina, Lula Mine, that Garis was Randa Chi Tsini Yukuni, Daniel Kumbala, Daniel Kumba, Danis the Tashiva, Jebachivas, or Daniel Kumbasi, Jebachivas. Jisa Miu de Sula Moyson. 제자데 당보 수디게 랑이 친이디 제바다 시럽니게 제바 잼베파 랑이 친이디 잼베지 델레 시럽기 제바체 다네스 시럽 제바초콤 또 제바체도 안네 류기네 상디 뭐디 랑이 친이디 류세디 데네시레도 선배게 하고구로와 하고 차외 제라 다네 류디 데네 가르세디 아니 류디 아니 디데야 지칭이 고미야 차고 당보 랑게 칭이데 제바체 랑게 류레 미네 랑게 칭이 제바체 제가 잼베지 아니 셰럽기 바 제바체 콤바데라 제가 랑게 류레 미네 랑게 칭이 다네 콤바세 고데라.
Last time we did look at the way to perform this meditation in relation to the first of the four observed objects, the body, but I think it's good to summarize it again or represent it again, just to make sure it's clear. So having come to understand, first of all, what is meant by the body, so in the first outline, the divisions of body, then one meditates on the specific characteristics of the body. How to do so? One takes the observed object to mind, holds it with mindfulness, and then with wisdom investigates the entity of the body. Or, to express it differently, one takes the object of the body, holds it with mindfulness in an undistracted manner, and investigates the specific characteristic, the entity of the body with wisdom. Thereafter, when one comes to realize that, yes, This is the way the body abides. The entity of the body is elements and the composites of the elements. Then it moves on to the next step, which is to meditate on the body's four general characteristics, or the general characteristics of the body.
다 라위게 셰르위 라싱이 뒤데 취두리 세 누신의 제바 제제 되네 간점질이야 차상 뒤에 계기 뒤비게 다 공부 숙직 라바지 줍지 네 아니 숙수로만 되네 다 숙수에 되네 셰도와 선배하고 되데 대대 아주게 술라 미시에 랑이 생이 제바 제제 공부디래다 원하시기 맞대 주수 현대지게 레용도 렉자 녀여로와 진짜 렉자 맨날 녀여봐 진짜 렉자 여봐 진짜
Then let's look in some more detail at how to engage in this actual meditation of the specific characteristic of the observed object of the body. Because one needs to understand how to do the meditation, and then one can gain familiarity and experience utilizing mindfulness and wisdom. So we see that the body, the entity of the body are the elements and composites. So here we hold the observed object, the body, with mindfulness, and now we're going to investigate with wisdom, investigating the role that the four elements play. So the body is comprised of a composite, or the four elements coming together, a composite of the four elements. These are required for there to be the body. So the function that heat plays is that it brings, or that fire plays, the element of fire, is that it brings heat. If the fire element is overwhelmed, then we experience cold. If the fire element is in balance, then we have a comfortable, we are comfortable. Water, the element of water, this brings about moisture, subtlety to the I'm not pronouncing it right, to the body, to the moistness to the body. Then that the third element, that of earth, brings a firmness to the body, and the fourth, that of wind. This enables, or wind energy enables change to come about within the body, or you could say inner development, inner change within the body, that there can be development over time. So that for this, the element of wind, or wind energy, is required. And then having the four elements having come together, then the observed object of the body can be touched. It has a taste. It has a smell. So we see how that it can be touched and has a taste and smell that the body does have, is because of these elements coming together. So this we can only come to know through investigation. We can only come to know the entity of the object of the body through utilizing wisdom, and wisdom can be effective through it being combined with mindfulness, holding of the object in an undistracted manner.
tu sine cheba komdi bige cheba chine kombige ta jamba da sherap ni di ane kasore zoro chagore zo jamba jambige zechi janche yudile jan lydile jan den sherap ki du sine cheba chigoro zo che denja denigi jamba da sherap ni bodi an jamba nya sha se ordingile ta di ane jamba ni di ni jibure besan di mare di da dingom도 망보여라 제가 디 코로나 중염도 집에 셈여래 띵이지 여래 디쳐산 잠반이 자래 다디나데데 잠반이 샤스도 초 잠바다 시럽니 조 송지 디기 뒤발라기도 디나데 수 뒤여래 차상 여래 제가 잠바다 시럽니다 총된도 주기 셈다 셈중 차상 잠반이 자래 디가 수 류래 되네게 랑기 천이 류래 제바치네 제바지 신배 내가 되네 제바지비게 잠바다 시럽니데 띠엔제 제바지비 내가서 잠바다 시럽니데 총된도 주비 셈중다 셈 가래연아 차상 근데 잠반이 자샤도 그러지 잠만이 딜람 용어죠. 데 띵에 진게 파서 하름 신내에 차고 그러는데 그래서는 그 람주지 가자인데 전주선바 인사 그 신내 톱사와서 류레미요도 신내 띵에 진디게 땅안 주게 띵에 진디 유들라 수텔레 류텔레 제치도 내신병 안에 데 잠바된 아니 셔럽게 제바지고로와 지난디 내내게 제바지비게 잠바다 셔럽니 보디 류 잠바 가서 대당 손den기다 셈셈죠 차상 아니 류라 랑기 친이기 다녀 공비기 다 잠바냐샤시 오르다 거의 와치나 랑기 친이 다녀 공바지.
This then is how to engage in the meditation of the close placement of mindfulness on the body, reflecting on its specific characteristic. And one does so, which hopefully is clear, with holding the object with mindfulness and then utilizing wisdom to investigate the object. However, mindfulness and wisdom are not the sole mental factors that are involved here. There is, of course, a primary consciousness, a main mind, as well as a variety of other mental factors. But these are considered the principal ones in this meditation. There will, of course, be the mental factor of stabilization, which, because this meditation is being done by someone who has cultivated a path within their continuum already, this mental factor of stabilization that we all have would have been developed to the strength where they have actual calm abiding, actual single-pointed concentration. So they'll have very powerful stabilization. The mental factor of stabilization will have already been developed to a very powerful level. So there are, in particular, this other mental factor, as well as all the others, such as feeling and so forth, that come with a main mind. However, in this practice, the emphasis is placed on the two mental factors of mindfulness and wisdom, although these aren't the sole mental factors that are being utilized.
다 되네게 류딜에 두스 랑의 친이 제바지 검체위기다 랑의 류이데 뭐 되네 셰샤선 하고 거서에 제라 다 될에 지친이 다 미다 왔습니다. 그래서 다 류이디 되네게 뒤된 게 초백에 초는 줍디비 수시리 다 한다지 간스투 세 규와 간스투도 세 제바치에도 당한서 락바락 봤습니다만 당보 아미기 조나레베 충충지 아미 조건마 수제 충충지 마도요 말 만데냐 도수도 제체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체체 ba se de yuwa rugu be de du samda rakba dirwa da del ba chara chi chesa du chendana chi de an dangbo drup keji ni ba di magic ba para de la kanish du la na ta mere da ko drup ne ta keji dangbo drup ni ba ji ru ko ke dangbo drup ni ba ji ru chesa de ne gi dangbo drup ne ani magic ba para de ne dues tu du mi chepa che 다디 매와 그 드룹이나 계지 당보 드룹네 계진이 받는 지도 받이 유루고요 받이 하고 그러와 제가 두스 제바 제제 간데스 두스는 파 제바지 당보 가서 락바디 제바지네 야 차차차 추제직 까마직 세간직 디나올로야 디간데스 두고 섬데다 지도 람상 줍제 계진이 받는 지도 봐 계지계지 지도 봐 통고래 제가 디 통에도 풍보디 공오라 뒤전기기 촌에 드룹디게 락바 수치래 이나 그런 깨지깨지 지신 줍네 깨지니 번 미디어바 유어저링이 제샤 선비게 지 딱봐 때문에 되게 균에 레메지사 딱봐 레면도 그래서 깨지깨지 유어저는 제샤 선비 하고도 디달에 제바치도 근데 다시 지층이 미다발 제바치 공부 지사 디네 제바치 고미야디 다 곰비게 잠바당 시신 셰라 잠바당 셰랍 땡이다 손는 주비게 근데 샘심주 차상 아니 지천이 류라 지천이 미닥바 제바치는 곰백이 안 잠깐만 샤세 책으로 봐. 지금 온체로 니가 어디래 니가 말로 와대.
So hopefully then it's clear then how to engage in the actual as a meditation of the specific characteristic on the body. Then, having meditated on that, with mindfulness and wisdom, one then moves to meditate on the 4 general characteristics of the body, starting with the first, impermanence. Impermanence, the meaning of impermanence is that the body changes. It was that the impermanent object changes, in particular momentarily. So we start the reflection as per usual with looking at change in a coarse manner, seeing how we were conceived, we grew within our mother's womb, then we were born, and we continue to grow, and eventually reach adulthood, and then at one point the decline of age became very apparent. So we see this coarse process of impermanence in play. Then we take it to a subtler level, and we look at the momentary change. And we think to ourselves, or investigate here with wisdom, where in this process has there been any stability, any time where there was not change? Because the meaning of impermanence is that the impermanent phenomenon changes momentarily. Conversely, the meaning of permanence is that there is not momentary change. So impermanence specifically refers to subtle impermanence, subtle change. And we investigate and see that from the moment of conception, the very next moment, there was change. There was no period of abiding. And this continued not just from the first to the second moment, but to the third, and continuously, right up to this point in our life when we're engaging in this meditation. Every moment was preceded by a moment of change and followed by a moment of change. There's been no period of abiding, which means there's been no period of stability at all. So therefore, our body, or form in general, is not at all stable, but changes from moment to moment to moment. So this then, in brief, is how one engages in the meditation of the general characteristic of impermanence of the observed object of the body. One does so with mindfulness, holding the object, and in an undistracted manner, and wisdom engaging in analysis, and as well as all other associated accompanying mental factors. And this then is a close placement of mindfulness on the body.
rangi tsinyu kum tsayo chile mitaba, chi tsinyu mitaba kumyada. Tadin, yang suyu pungpala mi chi tsinyu dunga wa kumya. Tadin, tatanga dusira su nga luyu di kari dusina deji tangwa samdaya di duten kihe tsopi ki ane su chiki imba. Ande yang kichi yuwa zhoti ki imba. Anda yuwa zhoti ba ina, anda nga luyu di le kari yungu dusina subu tela tene chik naya da, an chik subutil ma chayo be naza taya, chida dunga yungu duwas. Dan dine dunga kiki dus. Chisa yana subutil nga su kabrel ya dus chine chik sirtine chik kibura tuyde kabla, yang gansam chik dine telang na yudu, yang gansam chik yuwa chinche kangara chad. Yang chik cawara chik cawa chik jangmo chadan kya duyan sar. Yang chik dus chen, dambo dus chen, tuyde kabla, telang na yudu kabla, yang mangbo tuyos tuyde kabla, yang chik kanga kale chad. Chisa tingarang zuliya tsogi sa chik tsowa dewa ki, chisa gyur che dunga yungo lamsa gyur dunga ki yungo dus. Chisa dine zang lui tela tene dunga ligidu, gyur dunga ligidus. Chisa da lui tela tene dunga yungo, gyur dunga yungo wadi, lui tela gyur ngara yore, kara chene yungo waresti. Sidi paa jeba chigoro wadangazo, jamba tenche, jambi shira jeba chedu. Chisa jedu dan lui de gana chene dhubo ware samdayadu. Chisa lui de dangbo dhu yungdu ane kari rosane. Zoge lui le ame ki ngazu sukpudi ame lui ni maa duen pare. Ame lui nala ane dokdo cha. Diyan ya paa jeba chene, ane dangbo ane ji xue naxin lawu xe. Ane diyan jeba chene, dangbo ane paman iki kuchaya dui xe. Dine chine nga sudi zhubdu ba shire shaas, ya jeba che, dine ya jeba che korwa da.
Then, having meditated on the first of the general characteristics relating to the observed objects of the body, one moves to the second, that of suffering. Or more explicitly, being in the nature of suffering. So here one reflects on the observed object of the body, holding it with mindfulness, investigating the general characteristic of being in the nature of suffering with wisdom. So we've come to already realize that the entity of the body is that it's comprised of the four elements and the four composites of the elements. And having reflected on that, we then reflected on the momentary change, its impermanent nature of the body. Now, we reflect on its being in the nature of suffering, its suffering nature. Here we reflect on how this body is subject to the experiences of the suffering of physical and mental pain, as well as the suffering of transient happiness. In terms of the suffering of physical and mental pain here, the first of the three types of suffering, this we're familiar with. Perhaps sitting in our meditation, we have some pain in our knees, pain in our back. There is some, at the very least, often some discomfort, but often pain. Moreover, we have experience of illness. And this experience of illness or pain is something that comes about not in a planned way. It comes about through its own causes and conditions, not something we have control over. So here we see again, there's no stability. We have no control over our experiences of illness and pain. Moreover, this body is, we experience the suffering of transient happiness, the second of the three types of suffering. We sometimes are too hot, sometimes we're too cold, etc. And even when we're comfortable, that changes. And then so we're just right, but then we get a bit too hot. Or we're just right, and then we get a little bit too cold. So this is the easy way to understand, but we go into more detail that this body is in the nature of suffering, utilizing these two illustrations, or two types of suffering. The first being that the body is an illustration of being the suffering of physical and mental pain, and secondly, the suffering of transient happiness. Having reflected on that, we go to this next part of the meditation, which is, why is it so? And we reflect on the causes that led to the attainment of this body. And so there have been many causes over the course of our life, as well as causes relating to our womb, but it comes down to the joining of the sperm and egg. So from these causes, we have achieved or attained this body which is the basis upon which we experience physical and mental pain and the suffering of transient happiness.
Kala luna trela so that in new daily queen you said some big new daily tasia ligirwa, new daily tachigirwa. On the nation, to get dunga le, gu dunga lady. Chesan to do tell at in the dunga ligidu, gu dunga ligidu, Chesan ludi dunga gu dunga new resha. This is that ludi ganesine deniki quenchi doos, that he queen ganesura, says the Jabachi de Gala, then ludi queen, then you have ludi ganesuaresne. Amal emitohanan bojo denia de aya chiche and tartuna and garatin to us amiki kuta dubalet in the truk to get a shasme diba do some diadi di some dangor wada.
You remember when we looked at the observed objects in detail, the observed objects of the body had those three subdivisions, which showed that it encompasses all objects of form. So here in this meditation, we primarily focus on the body, but one can focus on other objects. So we take a vessel, for example, a cup and a glass, and we pour inside some milk, and what happens? Naturally, the milk rots. Or we take a plate and you put some delicious food on it, naturally, it rots. So we see there it's in the nature of suffering. But moreover, we can relate this then directly to the body, seeing how that the form, that these illustrations of form, delicious food and milk, they rot because of the causes that they came from. So going back to our body, causes such as milk that rots, and food, delicious food, that also if left alone rots, this is what we take as causes to sustain our body. So no surprise, no wonder that our body will, left to its own devices, will rot, will degenerate. And yes, so here we can see some causes that we utilize to sustain the body, but really going right back down to the cause of this body was the sperm and egg.
Di luni kaha chen duen chen nyom le barwa nyam. Chezan du chine nyom de nyoya diang dinye la gyu kaha che jik di pei luni chore, jik di mei luni duwa re sa che. Da dine cheba che pei luni yon dan di ganes yon re sli che ko kien gari chine yungu re lab yon du. Chezan pali ya chabe chaksam ge, chaksam di wangi chiga lul ya zowa che yo du ma koa di tuanpa. Amagi di chesan pama nyi chaksam kye pala tene dangpo nyi ke pama nyi chaksam kye. Chaksam nyi kye du pama nyi lu showa che che pa zowa bezu che yo du dele tene soso lu soso de duen che nyi kasa ore da mei di chaksam kye ke na mena gonga di yue li ba che pegi di mei jik di mai ne chungwa re jik di pa de chungwa re chesan di nge chakpe wanga dus kyen che ne du chene kuniga nyamdu tuyadi di genjene tu so nyamdu josware chesa du chene yongare sha chesa dinigi yongade gyuzodi an dene ya chakbe wongge du chene bezo jebale dene yongade resha smhago tu burwa jebaje.
We go a little further back and looking at the causes that led to this body, because sperm and egg, a fertilized sperm and egg an egg fertilized by sperm didn't just happen. It came about because of the sperm of our father and the egg of our mother joining together. And they came together through the intention of our parents, and that intention was dominated by the afflicted mind of attachment. So through the condition of the attachment that was within our minds of our parents, then the egg was fertilized by sperm, and that then led to the development of our body. So when we go back to a subtler level of the causes that led to the fertilization of the egg through our father's sperm, we see that in our parents' continuum, attachment dominated, the afflicted mind of attachment dominated.
Yudi and the chapel on the Jivas and Yomo Wangi, Yetubaji, Yudila, Gyönji, Yomo on duty with Yomo, Gyönj, the next Dusha, Gyön, the next doors and big, that Yudile, Gyön, Yomo Bash doors and big Dahurwa. That Denena sometimes that Denegi Pamani, Chapel Wangi, doos, Chene, Zedi Pa, do yon do Galwa. Ding a Luke and a Chagres, intimate a Lu Chatugres, Milu Chagres. 차베 내가 요말 미차야기 게 차에 내가 요말 들려야 세상 내가 메도 인지 민지 내가 메도 다디 뒤발에 때네 류 차발에 미 차발에 다 유산다시 고우도스 로아 코로니 뒤바 점기 미류 차투고 민도 세상 마차바 먹고 거 저도 코니 뒤제 미류 차발라 유산다지 고우도스 내가 제바지 거거다 다 유산다 가르고 라도 디나리아도 제바지 디나 남시지 슈바 고고도 남시 슈로 제가 남시 매바이나 디 밤에 디니 뒤바이나 가슴질 철라서 매바 차로 거로 제가 야게 철철차 야게 두고 말 제가 마저바 자 코니 야 철철철 야게 줘와디 내 류차야디 제가 아주 미 류차야디 될 가르고 무슨 규시한다지 고고래서 제바지도 디날 남시 슈고도 좀 하고 거다 남시 슈고도 좀 하고 제가 남시도 슈용도 다 남시 주체의 제라 안 디기 루이텔이야 가긴 발체한다 마중 바이나 니네 거니 야 지야 차차차차 루투구도 와선배 두스전에 제바지 걸어와
When looking back at the causes that led to our body, we see how the causes we take in to sustain our body, they themselves are contaminated and therefore will lead or cannot sustain the body but lead to its decline. Further back, we see that we were conceived in our mother's womb, so we came from a fertilized egg. So our parents' substances coming together. And therefore we grew in her womb and were born and have grown ever since. We take it back further and we see that the egg was fertilized by sperm because of attachment in the minds of our parents, attachment being an afflicted mind. Hence the result of their afflicted behavior was a contaminated result. So that process hopefully is clear, but there's one further cause that hasn't been mentioned thus far. So this fertilized egg, why is it? Was that the cause of my body? We've understood thus far why it's a cause of a body. Why is it the cause of my body? Well, to be a cause of our individual body, a further a cause is required to come together, and that is the entering of a main mind or primary consciousness into the fertilized sperm and egg. That is required. Without a primary consciousness entering the fertilized sperm and egg, there is no life. So once our primary consciousness entered the fertilized egg, then growth could come about, and barring any further obstacles, we would be taken to full term and our body would be born.
다 되네 될 남시도 용국도 선배 제발 남시도 고고요 받하고 다 되네 될야 남시디 가능스 리거에서 야 가wan 리거 심지적으로 와 그래서네 베네 찍디한 중에 숙차에게 니디 찍데 바벨론에 된바래 찍데 아멜린 된바래 딩이디 거기 됐을 때 남시디 바벨론에 된바래 아멜린 된바래 가왈디 된바래 스파체바체요도 제가 되네게 남시 슈에디 간디스 슈구도 간디스 용구도 가와나 용구도 제바체도 제가 저게 개왕아마게 남이게 남시네 개왕아만 마 용구요 바데 하고 그러와 제가 남이게 개냐마게 찍찍제데 되는 마직 용구요 바데 남만에 현재 제자디 다디디 남시 슈마 타베기 딩아마디 개왕아마 차려요 바 제가 딜레디 간디스 리고르스는 바르도와 세죠로 바르도에 긴리고래 바르도와디 디나데 슈고래 바르도데 딘마 레제 디나데 파미기 구라니 조르바당 코 디나데 시르 바르도데 시네 디나네 남시 슈르고 세상 바르도데 가왈리고스는 개왕 아미기 미치 시제 미나다가 미나 sem전지 직시제 디기 남시데 가서 바르도 줍제 딘데 교시에샤 아슴베 누스제 개왕아마들 하고 그러고라다.
Understanding then that primary consciousness is required for life to originate, for the fertilized egg to have life, then where did that primary consciousness come from? It didn't come from our father. He provided a cause for the body. It didn't come from our mother, who provided a further cause for the body. Neither of them provided the consciousness that entered the sperm and egg. Rather, this was the primary consciousness of ourselves that had come from somewhere. It wasn't together with our parents, certainly not their continuum. It's a separate continuum, our continuum. And this came from the intermediate state. And the intermediate state is where, when a being in a previous life dies, they go to the intermediate state before taking rebirth in the next realm. So therefore, our primary consciousness that entered into the fertilized egg came via the intermediate state, but from whatever life form we were in whichever samsaric realm we were in, when we died, we traveled on this journey, ending in the fertilized egg of our parents.
Denigi Bardo di Dinade Yongade and Karashor, Injimiji Bardo de Shandajil Power Russian degree, Dinagadas Yongshingo city, that Dinade Yongo de Karishkin in the Yungure Lavio, Chizan Dinade Yongo di Lake Kinji in the Yungure, says you had been another Sing Lomaji Dinba Juro, the Ganis Jugo Lavio, Lungi Den draw, says you Lungi Pa, Bijetan do Codin Badugorba, Chizan Bene Sing Loma Teone. They two young women didn't Madrona degree was a some the China. They two young at the gas and Lungi pennies Lungi did two debate, didn't two so young as a shiro. Dinashi, Chesa Bardo Adi, Amigi di, Pame Dinigid, Kuda Joa, Della Yongo Carceres, and Yawanga Legi debates, Legi, Les Arch, Legi Deja, Codeles on Valecere. And Lady Garel, Gansungure, Labdu, Canessa, what I said, Daddy, Kuno, Yomo Baji. Yomo Wangi, Geshe Thubten. The young and Kunodi, Nga Sibenga, Tautrubatim, Tazin, Telatin Ligdua, Sempich the less I didn't see Ligdua, Sempi, two Chile, da, Dina Namshi Leba di Karazin, Nyamagi, Maribe Wangi, Yomo Bati, Yomo Wangi Lesa, Lady Kinch the Shukinche, Namshi di Dina Ligduas. Cesada, Namshi di Dina Shusai Gyälwa, di and Pamigi de Nidi and Nilu Chas or that. Cesna di Legi Wangi, Delia Namshi di Ludi, Chisang Helu Chavade. Chisang Helu Chavada, Leda, Yomobo Wanki, Duptiva Reshas, Cesang Ludi, Leda, Yomo on the Duptiva Reshas. Cesna called Lugoron, Leda, Yomo on the Duptiva Insang. Da dela dine dunga the Yu dunga yon direshas. Chesa da me ludi le da nyomo onge juanza dunga was at the dunga verangin set direshas le da nyomo onge druptibe or coron lute la rawa medican le da nyomo onge druptibe de rawa medican rawa mebigeda dunga nyoa the Yu dunga nyongo ya chayadi nejedi yumchen tiredoa sembe hagodu 진 풍보디 dunga yerajin chawa duju dunga iba hago warda 맞아 dunga 숨기나네 chawa duju dunga ma hago 제가 dunga 와서 하고 그래지 진짜 내내게 제바제제 잠바다 시시 잠바다 시르니게 제바제 내내게 될라미 비팅이진 다 되네 셈심죠 디차상라 아니 류라 미네 아니 지체니 아니 dunga와 곰비게 잠바다 시진 곰비게 가서 잠바냐 샤다 그래지
So one may be wondering, why is there then intermediate state required? Why is an intermediate state required for one's consciousness to go from a previous life into this life? And how does one move through the intermediate state into this life? Well, just like, for example, when leaves on a tree, they're not static. Sometimes they just quiver slightly, sometimes they sway a lot due to the strength of wind. So similarly, due to the power of our karma, we take rebirth via the bardo into our next life. It's due to the power of karma that we take rebirth via the bardo into our next life. This karma then, how was it accumulated? Would have been accumulated under the influence or mixed with an afflicted mind. Perhaps more than one, but certainly the affliction of the ignorance of self-grasping. So therefore, through the power of the ignorance of self-grasping, we accumulated a karmic imprint in a previous life. And at the time of death, this ripened and propelled us into the bardo and then into the fertilized egg. So here we see that in this process of our consciousness moving from one form into the next, from one life form into the next, it does so due to contaminated karma accumulated by the afflictions. And therefore, because this process is done by contaminated karma and afflictions, it's something we have no freedom over, we have no power or control over. We have no control over this process. Our karma that was accumulated by the afflictions is what propels us. And we are propelled unwillingly, without freedom. And because this karmic imprint was accumulated by the afflicted minds, it's contaminated. And because this ripening karmic imprint that has propelled this rebirth is contaminated, this form that we have achieved, this body that we've achieved, is in the nature of suffering. And it is an illustration of the third type of suffering, the suffering of all-pervasive suffering. So our body then is in the nature of suffering and an illustration of the third type of suffering, all-pervasive suffering, which means it's independence on having such a basis, this contaminated body, that we are subject to the experiencing of the first two types of suffering, physical and mental pain and transient happiness. And these ripen, again, without control, without freedom. So here then, this shows the process and how this process of our consciousness coming into this body has been controlled, not by us with freedom and choice, but by the contaminated karma that was accumulated due to our afflicted minds. So this then is how one meditates with mindfulness and wisdom on the general characteristic of suffering in relation to the observed object of the body.
That is in Gyälwa juge ta ji chenye kasore tongwa se ko mare tongwa se di da xue rongwa ji tu be tongwa se ko re da xue rongwa ji tu be tongwa se la dang juge de dawa kata ge chage shina ye be tongwa ji ba re de dawa kata ge chage shi de ji sti so ye dawa kata ge chage shi jumda na la dawa kata ge chage shi yorwa düje tamje medaba saje tamje dungawa che tamje dongxin dame che tamje dongxin dame ba se jorwa jesa düje tamje medaba se de medaba samda da düje medaba che gore saje tamje dungawa se dadi de se gore da nga de kisha dungawa sa jeba che da jorwa dungawa da dongxin dongwa se de dongxin se dongwa se de da che rangwa jing ju be dongwa la gore da che rangwa jing ju ba la ne kha lo se da che rangwa ji bi ju be che ji yo ma de la gore da 딱 최 랑와 숨용 거래. 다최 랑와라. 랑와라네 가르스는 유단见라 마되베게 지금 유단见라 마되가 랑와세디. 뒤지게 최 간데는 유단 见라 되는 저 마도 유단 见라 마되베 랑와지요 말이래 거래. 다 근데네 사제에서도 사제기 진짜 누가요 라시야 야레스 사제라도 레다 녀모벌에 되는 주위 최차사 누가 와서 그래서 마도 델레 누가 많이 받지요 말에 사제 탐제 누가 와서 다 가소래 가소래 다세디 가서 다 최랑화 숨지와 랑화스는 규계라 마디베 랑화 유단 깨라 마디베 랑화 딱세디 기지기지 지바마도 기지기지 마지바질라 딱바시고로 봐. 되네 랑 최랍들이 차셰라 마디어봐. 차셰 강라 마디어봐. 그런 거는 주되게 최서 지부와시고로. 제가 다 딱바 되네 랑왕와 차셰라 마디 지부와 되네게 숨가 초딩인지 여봐이나 될라 다치 랑와진 주바라 그래. 되네게 다치 랑와진 주바를 요 말해라 그래. 다 지루바 간사 가시게 따시랑와 주도 봤어요. 요래서 그래서 간사 세디 그 딱바를 해서 간사세 딱바를 해서 제상 거기지 지해요 말했어. 먼저 풍부의 지루고 그래. 샘이 매와 지루고 있는 간사 지해요 뭐 간사 딱바를 해라 그래. 제사다 간사디 유단 见하나 되어요 말했어. 그런 유단 见거 랑와래서 랑와지래서 지상 간사들의 차시에가 하여 말이야. 지상 차시라 마디어봐. 지상 간사세디 차시라 마디어봐. 그런 직부에 되겐 유단见라 마디어봐. 랑왕에 되겐 Gyē gyūne me na tāpa we rāngshīn, tēne kāngsā shirī, ēsini tākchū rāwān chīngi drupē kāngsā, tēne chī yore, sēdi, tā chīrōpi kē kēlīngō rē, Hindu tā tēne kē kēlīngō rē, chēsā kōnsu kē, dī kāsō rē, jītīng kōpa bō sē, chēgirwa jītīng kōpa, ondī dī kēlīngō rē. Tā ngā rā chū nāngbē kī kāla kōrā sē, kāngsā sēdi, tēne chī yō mā rē sē kōrā, chēsā kāngsā sēdi, 유단见了对的诸国嘛，都云南嘛对吧？要嘛来是云南见了对的诸国人上，让往要嘛来是，让往要嘛，可是有个可叫嘛都可能来让往要嘛，有个那些那的，可亚国菜的有亚国菜的，可亚国菜的有都两百菜的，可亚国菜嘛来是，让往要嘛来是。那大半嘛的，可给这个就有的记住过了，有住过了是，就是大半嘛的是，但呢。차시에 뭐 직보야 말에 가서 차시를 뛰어디 거래서 그냥 아주 풍보를 뛰고 수를 뛰고 이제 차시를 뛰어디 거래. 진짜 되니게 숨과 줍트가요. 맞지 가서 해야지. 되네 숨과 마주바래. 주바디 되네 숨이 줍이 동아래서 되네 동아들라 다치랑 완전히 줍이 동아다 거라고. 다딩이 가사를 시원다 가사데. 다딩이라. The Gansa said, you can do about it in the Rawa Mare, Kiji Jibare, Tapa Mare, Chizan Gansa the Chashil Durbanza, and the Jibu Mare. Chizan Gansa said, the Kiji Jiba, Gudan Genle, Dunu Juba, and the Chashil Duty, Sumba Scotti, Mado, the Sumga Madubade said.
Thereafter, when holding the observed objects of the body with mindfulness, one uses wisdom to investigate the third general characteristic of emptiness. Emptiness here has the same meaning as in the four seals. So the four seals are all compounded phenomena are impermanent, all contaminated phenomena are subject to suffering, all phenomena are empty and selfless, nirvana is peace. So here, this is referring to the seal of being empty. And what is the person empty of? Being permanent, unitary, and independent. So here, one investigates in the third general characteristic that the person is empty of being permanent, unitary, and independent. So most non-Buddhists, especially those who accept a creator God, they believe that the self or the person is permanent, unitary, and independent. Buddhists, though, reject that, holding that the self is empty of being, or the person, is empty of being permanent, unitary, and independent. And this is because taking the characteristic of being independent first, if the person were independent, the person would not depend on causes and conditions. And this is held by non-Buddhists, but Buddhists hold that this is not the case. The person is dependent on causes and conditions. The better the causes are that one accumulates, the better the result. The worse the causes are, the worse the result. The next, and furthermore, we see in relation to the previous meditations, how the person is the person is in the nature of suffering due to the causes being contaminated karma. The body is in the nature of suffering due to the causes being contaminated karma accumulated by the afflictions. So therefore the person cannot be independent. It's pervaded by these causes. And the second characteristic of unitary, or a clearer term, a clearer translation of single. Single means if the self was single, or the person was single, it wouldn't depend on parts. It would not have parts, it wouldn't depend on parts. But the person certainly has parts. So non-Buddhists will assert that the person is independent of parts, or does not depend on parts. Whereas Buddhists would assert that certainly it does have. And the third characteristic, that of being permanent. Again, non-Buddhists, especially those who believe in a creator God, would say that whilst the physical and mental aggregates, they are impermanent, the person is not. The person is permanent. Buddhists do not hold this view. Buddhists hold too that the person is subject to momentary change. So here, in this meditation on the third general characteristic, the person is seen to be empty of being permanent, unitary, and independent.
당한도 풍부에 때라 다시 라와진이 두표 동화 세디 제바 제대 같이 왔으네 제가 풍부 세디 다 다시 라와진이 줍나 딱바 있나 기지기지 교화메틴 기지기지 교화마도가 직되고 그래서 제가 풍부 세디 기지기지 교화도 대신에는 미다바 제바 제서로 제가 풍부 세디 기지기지 교화도 랑 두표 기지 이반이 봐 매바 차도간 책도 제가 교화도 제가 기지기지 마집에 딱바데 재미도 다 마인자 다 안에 가르스네 다 풍보데 대신한 저기 규단建了定的个是东华三大队지지야 마규 망보 삼다서 지사 풍보세데 규단建了定的这个지사 규단建了定的主啊규단建也向往的双不的지사让往民都是지사今天你让往人民규단建了定的主把写的是지사 규약过去那可要过去的규东啊教学呢就教学지사 규를让往嘛都可能了约的没是규를把让来的지사 규를的你규를 맞지 봐 다 풍보세데 지부에 미리미도 차세 망고도 대신하도 풍보 삼다도 디나르야 풍보들이야 차세 망보 유배 제배나 당아도 디나르 풍보에 나라야 매일 중위게 중화 추유 중화 세유 중화 안데 룽규 중화 안데래야 뒤세 안데 가서래 제당 레자당 안데니게 로당 수다 데네 망보 초데 직 망보래 데네 되게 봐마도 데네 갈라야 마도 허 숙디레세 가마티가 숙치부시 샤미도와스 진짜 매반자 숙디 아니 차샤라마티베 지부와다 레멘도 지부와 레멘도 규엘라메티베게 라와제 레멘도 기지기지 지바 메비게 딱바제 레멘도 디숨과 초바디 디숨게 초비 주바데 동아레샤 선배 삼다데 제바제 두스 삼다여도 저게 아니 지천이 안 동아세 공고 제바제 제거로
So that previous segment was about reflecting on the person not being permanent, unitary, and independent, and because this is usually with a meditation in relation to the person. So here we would do it also in relation to the form aggregate, the actual observed object of this close placement of mindfulness, seeing how the form aggregate or the body is also empty of being permanent, unitary, and independent. If it were permanent, it would not change momentarily, because that is the meaning of permanence. Permanent phenomena do not change momentarily. However, the body, we know, changes momentarily. There's no process of abiding at all. It changes from moment to moment to moment. So therefore, the first characteristic of being permanent is not fulfilled. The body is empty of being permanent. Secondly, in terms of being unitary or single, the body is dependent on parts. If it were unitary or single, it would not be comprised of parts, it would not depend on parts, but the body is comprised of many parts. For example, those that we reflected on in the specific characteristics of the body. The body is comprised of parts being the four elements and the four composites. So here we already see a number of parts that the body depends upon. So therefore, the body is empty, or the form aggregate is empty of being unitary or single, but is rather dependent on parts. The third characteristic, that of being independent. If the body were independent, it would not depend on causes and conditions, but as we've already reflected on in detail in the previous characteristic of being in the nature of suffering, the body is dependent on a wide number of causes and conditions. If the body were not dependent on causes, it would be independent. But we've already seen that the body is empty of being independent in that it is dependent on so many causes and conditions. So here we come to see that the body is empty of being permanent, unitary, and independent.
아라운 주기라 잠반야샤 디컵시베 잠반야샤 디 람디 귤레 끼요 말때 이네 땅아라운 주기 디께게 단달로 고매요로 받데 장주심 맞게바이네 장주심 고매요로 받아 제가 미바다 남바 지바 루이 삼다제 고매들레 잠반야샤 곰식으로 받아 잠반야샤 고매 제가 디네 연자 땅아라운 주기 장주심 받는다 람냠len 제게네게 디네 곰바나시 땅아라운 주기네다 디나신제 고매알이야 소수의 담보 소수 류레 삼다제 소수 류디 근데 간디시 줍샤 뭐 간디시샤 삼제바치네 류리아 난 중화다 중위고 삼다야 안디샤자디 고삼도 티텐시레도와 샘비게 두스제바제 고미아 디시제바제 다나 제바셰바 나신제지 곰나티 랑게 챙이 샘데 두삼다 다 소수수부디네 제도와 삼다베 딘데 수부디다 간디시샤 고 딱바 띵부데 게디나 데행시레데 게디나 마디겐시샤 디시제바치도 있고 요르고 봐도 신당아 저기 락바락바디게 삼다투고와 아메키도 충주마도 요마다 자야야 처장 두수 주도와 요아딘 주도와 선비게 안도 지나네 제 파차차 다데네 대시 쇼게 요바다 때문에 주제 까마지긴 예를 요바다 다다메 세두 chen 제바체도 다 기지기지 지바세들이도 왔다 딱바 템부 딱바 땡데리면도 기지기지 봐 유루도 선비게 삼다리 미다와 삼다 제그로와 안데나 네다 미다바이나 데니게 델레 류텔이야 나제 동아 게야다 지기데 가브리엘이야 대와치 기우르셔나 남산 유르셔 강알레야도 간스 용고를 선배체바치 당한 류디 디제 셰바 나신 간스 두고레 파 귤파 삼다 두다들 파 삼다이도 데네 아니 아미류일 마도 아미 파미 쿠다니르도 데자마야 델야 넘버 셰바 슈야다 안데 간스 용고레스네 gyälwa ngame leki wangi dinde igores chesa le de kan's ligorasene nyomo baje nyomo be wangi le sa go lemba de kale de nga sebe ta se marik baje pene ngi se de ngara du liora o da ngi jige da bo nga sa samta de ngi lunga is nyeju du sujum sungin se bege dene samlo de ligorwa chesa da bo nga sebe nga sin de dene ngi sujum sungin se be samle de ko le sa go wa chesa nga sin le dene nyomo ba de le dene le sa then ma le yu wangi le ma pasha simgi de pasha ma sha de ma shiro chi de se ba de lemba se de nyomo ba che che ndigi ya min ba che che de ma amin yin sa pamani ku de duba na ma ande chi le yu wangi ba ta ya ki pe chi ka sa ri ta shi go ro wa on de ne yung du se be che ba che ne ta de ne sam da de che sa da dung ge ra shin re sha phung bo de ka re se ne 유고롱 아미게 주 도도 차야디 자위게 파미게 쿠자니 뒤발에 되네 파메 쿠자니 레야 대한 파메니게 착심 녀모 원게 중 진짜 유 녀모 원게 중 될레 귤레 녀모 버예디게 소소라랑게 디나 남시 슈바디야 레게 원게 녀모 발레다 녀모 원게 슈디게 될레야 남시 슈게 베jet당을 레 대한 자위게 녀모 다스 마레 바들레 중티오지 세상에 풍보디 유들라 레다 녀모 원기 준주바지레도와 세상고 동아이 라시레샤스 지나 데네 인자 델야 동아 규에 동아다 차바 가서 동아 리고레스 두스제바지려 저게 다 두삼 땅고고로와 데네 삼땅에도 소수기 류디 동아이 라시 임바시 하고 두고래 지나 데네가 하고 두도 가나저 갈리고레세네 땅아저 렘름 냠네 제바이나 메니 가소레 기부 딩게 람로 샤바 코유 동알이야 점다다 가지 미다바 삼들이 치와 미다바 삼다야 리고로와 미다바 삼다야 데네게 간주 류디레 삼다 동아이 데네 유튜브타 동아이 라시마 하고도 지상 코유알이 닝보메바 지상 델레다 타고도 셈베 타르두가 삼바 리고로와 지상 간주 델레야 간주게 데 잠바니자 끼요 말디네 두치네 고마 잠바니자 곰바이나 나저 갈리고로스는 코와레 닝보메바다 코와라 타르도게 삼바 타르바세 토부도 셈비게 타르바도니게 삼바 깨야다 다 소소 지부마이메 셈젠 탐제를 삼다베이나 셈젠 탐제 and the Sayoko Toku, some Jetamji, the Sayoko Toku, some big Janshu Sim Gyälwa, Lelo Chagor, Lela Yungor. Just like Dinigi has some diadi, and Nazuki Digi, that Jambanyaja, the Sheba Digi, and the two Changasule, Lapjel, Changas, Disam Tamwa, the Yechim Chagorwa. Midabada, Duma, the Gyälwa, Domba Shime, that it.
What we've covered then in this session is how a bodhisattva, a being who has generated a path of the Mahayana in their continuum, engages in this meditation. But this, of course, does not mean that for those of us who are still in the state of aspiring to enter into the bodhisattva paths, that we can just put this aside, that we have no need to do this meditation, or that we are not qualified to do it. Certainly, this is a meditation we should do. The way then to engage in the close placement of mindfulness on the body is to first hold the observed object of the body with mindfulness and investigate it with wisdom, investigate its entity. So here we start with the specific characteristic of the body, and we come to see in the way that was described earlier that the entity of the body is that it's comprised of the four elements and the four composites of the elements. The composites being that it has touch and a taste and smell. So, I'm missing one, but that's okay. It was said earlier. So those are the four composites. Then, as well as the four elements. So there we come to recognize what the entity of this body is. And then we go down to the general characteristics, starting with impermanence, seeing how from the moment of conception until now, the body has changed momentarily. There's no stability at all. It's always changing, and changing in a way that we do not control. We try and have some influence, but largely we kind of hope for the best. We do not control this process of momentary change. We link that then to the second general characteristic, that of suffering, or more explicitly, or more clearly, in the nature of suffering. So here we take the causes that led to this body back further, seeing how it came about not just from the joining of the sperm and the egg, but it came from the attachment in the mind of our parents, and then in terms of why our primary consciousness entered into the sperm and egg is because of the power of our karma, the karma that we accumulated. And that karma that we accumulated was done so under the influence, or the control rather, of afflictions. Certainly the ignorance of self-grasping, and possibly others. And that led to the accumulation of the karmic imprint that ripened and propelled our consciousness via the bardo into the fertilized egg. And therefore this was a process over which again we had no control. And now that we have this basis that has come about independent on contaminated karma accumulated by the afflictions, these aggregates are called appropriated aggregates because they were taken without freedom. They were attained without freedom and not with intention. Were intentionally rather, not intentionally, but were taken due to the power of contaminated karma accumulated by the afflictions. Therefore, the aggregates are contaminated. Being contaminated, they are the third of the three types of suffering, an illustration of all pervasive suffering, because they are a basis upon which we can and do experience the first two types of suffering, the suffering of physical mental pain and the suffering of transient happiness. And this we do without any control. The suffering is of course unwanted, but it ripens, and it ripens because we have this basis of contaminated aggregates. So here we come to see in the second general characteristic, which has a close relationship with the first, because we're looking at causes that mean that this is impermanent, we come to see that it's due to how we have this basis for suffering due to our contaminated karma and afflictions. And right at the very end of our previous life, further afflictions ripened, those namely of craving and grasping. And these led to the ripening of this contaminated imprint, and we took a new life. Craving and grasping for a new body, and then this imprint ripened and propelled us into this new life. So here, just in a summary, we've looked at these first two of the general characteristics. So, as you are mostly familiar with the presentation of the Lamrim, you'll see here, we've already reflected on impermanence, which is included in the practices shared with a practitioner of initial capacity, impermanence, as well as the trainings of a practitioner of intermediate capacity, who reflects on the sufferings of samsara. And here we've come to see how our body is the basis for suffering. It is an illustration of all-pervasive suffering. It is a contaminated aggregate. And here we come to reflect on how samsara has no essence. As long as we have such a basis, wherever we are in samsara, wherever we are born, we will suffer. We will experience no freedom from suffering. And that is what leads to the generation of definite emergence, the commitment to strive to be freed of samsara. So here we see how these meditations are shared with practitioners of initial and intermediate capacity, and now we need to include in the practitioners the trainings of a Mahayanas, of a being of greatest capacity, and we turn our attention to others, that we need to engage in these trainings for their sake, because they too are trapped in the same position as we find ourselves now.
Gyälwa 당은 저기 지칭이 다음에 봐. 대다 풍부된도 지칭이 다음에 보고 나고 뒤거시.
We'll conclude therefore this morning session. This afternoon we'll come to the fourth of the general characteristics, that of selflessness. So thank you.